Do you know what we can do in this country, dear friends? We can complain about the government and point fingers and tell them how useless they are, and we have plenty of evidence for that. We can foam at the mouth and we can stand around dry fires and entertain ourselves with lots of stories about incompetence and corruption, and all that stuff will get us nowhere. Because what we need is practical answers and solutions, and we need people to think about those things.
Radio Nuwe. Your Christian lifestyle radio station.
Chat with Corné.
We scratch
where it itches.
Today, as a guest, I am so honored to have with me one of the big thinkers in my mind, in any case, and that is David Ansara from the Free Market Foundation. David, thank you so much and welcome to Radio Nuwe.
Hello, Corné. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today.
You are from the Free Market Foundation. Would you please mind just giving us like a brief background on what it is and your role there?
All right. So Free Market Foundation is a policy organization. We're a think tank and a lobby group, and we are passionate believers in the freedom of the individual. So that means we want you as an ordinary person to have a strong set of rights, your right to own property, your right to trade, your right to freely express yourself, and your freedom of belief as well. And we see ourselves as part of the classical liberal tradition, which really has at its core this respect for the individual. And obviously individuals are free to organize themselves, whether that's in the form of a company or a civic organization or a religious organization. But we really want people to be the agents of their own destiny, to be able to decide for themselves and not have other people decide for them, and specifically the government deciding on your behalf. We have a very specific definition of what government should do, and it's very, very limited functions, which is quite different to the current situation in South Africa and in fact many countries around the world, where we see the government growing in terms of its size, living way beyond its means, taxing individuals very aggressively, spending way more than it generates in terms of revenue, borrowing very much on the international capital markets. And then also not just in terms of its size, but also of its scope. Government is increasingly involved in the day-to-day lives, the economic decisions, the individual choices of citizens. And we want to roll that back. We want to have a much more restricted and narrow conception of the role of the state.
It's a personal thing. I mean, all this is it's my show. It's my personal opinions. But that's one of my core things. I think for me, the whole foundation is personal freedom of the whole. It starts there. So
and personal
the government
responsibility comes with that.
Yeah, from your side, yes. So in my mind, the government should be three people: the boss, the secretary, and somebody else. With a bit of flesh around it, I guess. But in your opinion, what should the government be? If there are all these wrong things, what is the role of government actually?
So there was a French intellectual named Frédéric Bastiat who was writing in the middle of the 19th century, and he wrote about the state having three very specific concerns. Really, it's the protection of life, liberty, and property. And so the protection of life is the enforcement of the rights of citizens. So most people in a society get along very well with each other. There's a lot of voluntary exchange and cooperation. But there's some people in society who are bad eggs. They're malevolent actors. They want to do harm to other people. And so you need an authority, a sovereign, that can act against those kinds of tendencies and protect innocent individuals from that kind of harm, and also protecting the sovereignty of the country as well from outside aggressors. So that's why the establishment of a military and police forces, that is part of the apparatus of the state, which is designed to primarily protect life, but also the protection of liberty, your freedom to trade, your freedom to engage in public life, so to express your opinions, to associate with whomever you want, to form a company. Those are your basic freedoms. Your freedom of speech, for example, is very, very important. So in terms of the third component, property, private property rights and the protection of those rights is really integral to the state's function. So when you own property, you're not doing so at the behest of the government or the permission of the government, but actually that is your right of ownership is fundamental to you as a human being. When you invest your time and energy and your labor in, for example, cultivating crops, that is yours. That is an extension of your being. So you've invested your labor, and you extend your domain of ownership over these things. So that's not just land, but other property as well. Your retirement annuity or your equity portfolio, that is your property, because you have transferred your labor in the form of money to other investments, and those investments need to be honored. And if somebody can just seize that and take that away, then that's a breach of your private property rights. So these are the kind of values that inform our conception of what the government, how that should be structured, but also the state more generally. And that is quite different to the status quo that we see here in South Africa. So in South Africa, we actually have, I would argue, the complete opposite. We have a very socialistic system. So we have a constitutional framework which guarantees certain rights, like the Bill of Rights, I think is very, very strong, and that protects it, provides a lot of the mechanisms for the protection of individual rights. But the government and the ANC conception is very much a socialist one. So it wants to expand the reach of government. It is an active agent in the economic production process. So the government is inserting itself into economic relations. So if you consider the extensive industrial programs that South Africa has, there's a lot of subsidies, a lot of tariff protections for local industries versus imported goods. There's things like BEE, which basically is the politicization of the economy that gives the government the power to determine who you do business with, who your suppliers are, what the composition of your staff should be. And we really feel that that's an inappropriate role for the state to be playing. And the reason we think it's inappropriate is because this tendency towards centralization, firstly, it's very inefficient. So our belief is that markets are like emergent phenomena. They have a way of allocating resources very efficiently because it's basically about people pursuing their own self-interest and collaborating with each other on a voluntary basis. When you go to the shops and you buy a loaf of bread, no one's forcing you to do that. You're doing that because you're hungry, you want to eat bread, and the seller, the retailer, wants to earn a profit, and they're incentivized to keep their production as low as possible, because if they inflate the cost of that price of bread, then you as a customer are going to exercise your consumer rights and go and buy bread somewhere else. And so the price is an equilibrium between supply and demand, and is not just the cost of the good itself, but it also is a source of information. That's how complete strangers in a market economy can communicate with each other without even having to meet each other. Prices act as a vector of information. And when you have centralization, when you have a small bureaucracy or a political group that is making decisions on behalf of the economy or the economic actors in the economy, that introduces a whole lot of inefficiencies. So if you consider a collective economy like under the Soviet Union, the USSR, there were often these committees that would plan what the production of certain goods should be in a given year. So there would be the shoe committee, and they would say, okay, well, this year we need 3 million pairs of shoes to be produced. But they were always wrong in their predictions. No matter how smart they were, they would always either produce a surplus of shoes or a deficit of shoes, never the exact amount. And some subtle change in the weather or people's needs and demands would just throw out the whole system. And this was the same with the production of food. Often there would be famines or excessive production of a certain type of food, and that would lead to a lot of wastage. So markets are very efficient, but they also are a way to respect the individual needs and concerns of the people, of the citizens. So in South Africa, I think we're kind of stuck in this mentality that the government knows best and the government must be empowered to make decisions on behalf of people. But we reject that. We say that actually South Africans tend to know what's good for themselves. They should be free to exercise their own choices and also accept the consequences of those choices. So I interjected earlier and said that freedom comes with responsibility. And I think that that's very important. I think in South Africa, we have this sense of paternalistic attitude, like that some people, specifically people in the political class, they know what's best for ordinary South Africans, and they will guide and manage economic relations and other civic relations on our behalf. And we've got a big problem with that. We actually think that people know best what's good for themselves. And sometimes when they make the wrong decision, then they need to bear the consequences of that. And that helps you to improve your decision-making capacities. So, I think when we have these discussions around politics, and, I'm sure like many of your listeners, you consume a lot of media on YouTube and other platforms. And we see a lot of obsession over what's happening in the political domain. And it's kind of like a soap opera. What did Fikile Mbalula say next? And what did Gayton McKenzie do several years ago that's causing some controversy? Or, what is John Steenhuisen, what is he doing? But, part of our message as the Free Market Foundation is actually that we need to reduce the role of politics in our lives. So I think if you ignore politics and are naive about the risks associated with political action, then you maybe expose yourself to some of the downsides of politics. But what we want is actually to reduce the significance of politics in our lives. We actually what comes with a small state is not just efficiency, but actually an ability for you as an individual to pursue your own idea of the good life. And that's what informs our position. So, yes, there's questions of economic efficiency and what's the best way of allocating resources under conditions of scarcity. But it's also more of a philosophical position as well, that around mutual respect, around agency and empowering people to direct their own lives for themselves.
Lekker koffie word op die heel beste natuurlike metodes verbou in die hoof koffieproduserende lande in Afrika. Jy kan sommer die kwaliteit proe. Spesialis koffie van ander gebiede is ook beskikbaar. Jy kan jou bestelling plaas by juweliet.co.za. Dis beskikbaar in verskillende sterktes, as bone of gemaal en in 3 verskillende groottes verpakking. Onthou, as dit nie sê lekker koffie nie, dan is dit nie lekker koffie nie.
To me, I could never understand the thing of how people get to the point of the government knows best. It's always been a strange thing to me. In my mind, the people that should direct you, that's a job for a parent to get your child to, become a decent human being, one hopefully. But but to let them dictate to you how to live your life in any way or form is a strange thought to me. And then it's a beautiful system, actually. I don't know whether I'm new to all this terminology, but I think the capitalism thing is where it comes into. Then, if you leave the system to do its own thing, it is great at doing that. Like you mentioned there, it will balance out the whole thing almost by itself if you just let it be. So you don't need people to stand there with like the little whips and tell you what you can and can't do, because if you're a producer, the consumer will tell you whether you're doing it correctly or wrongly. And there's such a lot of parallels between parenting and this thing in my mind. Even on that,
Okay.
I am so against this whole thing of everybody should be the same. And I remember how mad I was when they decided, we're not going to tell you anymore whether you got 90% or 50%. It's like you passed with a distinction maybe, and then whatever, and you did not make it. If there's no feedback, how do you judge yourself? How do you improve stuff? How do you do if there's no standard to measure the stuff against? And it's almost the same thing to me in government now, that everybody needs to be the same, and the this and the that and the other. And it backfires hugely with all this stuff. In this country, I think the government runs itself like a little kingdom with a king and his minions, and we tap dance to that. Please explain to us, because it seems to be like if the focus is on the economy, you need the government in a smaller capacity, but you need it there to kind of oversee this thing. But the importance of having sound economics almost, it seems to be the thing that, what do they call it in English, that floats all boats or lifts all boats, the tide that lifts all boats in a country. Is that true? If we look at that thing, the economy, if we get a decent system in place, will that get this country somewhere?
Absolutely. So the Free Market Foundation, we do a lot of research and we produce a number of policy reports and analysis. So we do a lot of video content and other stuff on social media, but the foundation of our work is deep research. And every year we collaborate with another think tank in Canada called the Fraser Institute. And the Fraser Institute has a fascinating initiative called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And what this is a list of 165 countries ranked from the most economically free to the least economically free. So at the top, you'll have countries like Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, not technically a country, but an autonomous region, and New Zealand, Canada, those kind of countries, very free market oriented, and they tend to do very, very well in terms of human progress and human flourishing. So if you look at a variety of indicators, so life expectancy, quality of life, access to healthcare, your wealth as a person, the GDP per capita, these countries that are more economically free tend to perform very well in terms of other indicators. And then at the bottom of the index, you have very socialist countries like Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, where economic freedom is very limited, and some of these development indicators are a lot lower. So, I mean, even if you look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea, this is essentially the same country. It's been it's been one unified place for most of its existence for thousands of years, but since the 1950s, it's been kind of split along I think it's the 38th parallel. And you see these divergent outcomes. So the North, the DPRK, is very communist, and the South is capitalist. And on almost every measure, the capitalist South has outperformed the North, and even to the extent where, because of the differential access to nutrition, on average, South Koreans are about 6 centimeters taller than North Koreans, which suggests that they have better access to food and quality nutrition. So it's the index of economic freedom. And when we talk about economic freedom, we're talking about 5 key areas. So the first is the size of government, which I mentioned earlier. how expensive is it to run the state? How expansive is it? You know, if you consider in South Africa, we have about 35 ministries, I think it is, and over 70 ministers and deputy ministers, which is an extraordinarily high number. I mean, if you consider even just one department, like the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Gayton McKenzie's department, that costs the taxpayer about 13 billion rand every year. And at the beginning of the year, there was this huge fight over the VAT increase, and we want to see taxes as low as possible.
Yeah.
So we were very glad that there was a big fight over taxes. But ultimately, the revenue that would be generated from that increase in the VAT, the proposed increase, would have been about 14 billion rand. If you kind of look at the numbers, because also consumption maybe would have dipped a little bit, and so they wouldn't have gotten quite as much as they planned. So that just gives you a sense of the scale, and that's just one ministry, which is worth about 13 billion rand. And you must ask yourself, well, what is that ministry actually spending its money on? And it's not like if there wasn't a government department, then nobody would be doing sports days and running road races and playing rugby and not going to the ballet and not attending the theater. You know, these are human activities. People like playing sport and engaging in the arts. You don't need the government to provide that for you. So even though the Springboks are South Africa's national team, in a way, it's not the government that is producing the Springboks. It's part of the emergent phenomena. It's all of those feeder schools, those excellent schools that have a long tradition of rugby playing, and that knowledge is handed down through coaches and through kind of institutional practices. And that's why we have world champion rugby team. And they might be the national team, but they're almost like their own institution. So I think it's important to kind of think beyond the state or outside of the state, that the government positions itself as somehow like the custodian of the nation, but actually they're often a very narrow interest group that is acting within its own interests and not necessarily the interests of all citizens. So I think you can be patriotic and love your country, but that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything the government does. And I think most people who are watching or listening to this will agree that the government is not always acting in a benevolent way. So back to the Economic Freedom of the World Index, South Africa, out of those 165 countries, ranks 81st. So we're kind of in the middle. So we do fairly well on things like the judicial system, and we do have a private property rights framework, which, unlike many other African countries and some Asian countries, we actually have a fairly strong tradition of protecting private property rights. But I should stress that is under threat by the dominant political elite. There's this big push for expropriation without compensation, and legislation has been passed and signed by the president. There was an attempt to amend the constitution to dilute those protections under Section 25, which provides quite extensive protections for private property rights. We also do fairly well on sound money. So I mentioned there were 5 categories. So that's the size of government, there's regulation, there's your freedom to trade internationally, there's sound money, and then there's also the judiciary and private property rights. Those are the 5 categories. So it's almost like a composite index. So depending on how you rank on those 5 categories, then that will form your overall performance. So our performance is kind of uneven. But if you go back to the early to mid 2000s, where South Africa was experiencing quite a lot of liberalization of its economy and was growing quite strongly, about 5% per year for 3 consecutive years in the mid 2000s, you could see that South Africa's unemployment rate was going down. People were accessing housing and water and electricity much more readily. And also people were getting wealthier on a per capita basis. And our freedom score there, we were in the 40s out of those 165 countries. So the takeaway from that is that the more economically free you are, the more prosperous you are, the more people flourish. And many of our critics, because we're fierce proponents of free enterprise and capitalism, many of our critics will say, yeah, but look at these capitalist systems. They all have extremely high levels of inequality. And our view on inequality is quite nuanced. So obviously, it depends on how you arrive at that inequality. So in North Korea, for example, just to go back to that case that we were talking about earlier, most people earn pretty much the same level of income because it's determined by the government, similarly to Cuba. But they have extremely high levels of inequality because the political leaders actually have quite a lavish lifestyle and enjoy the fruits of capitalism, actually, other people's production from around the world. Kim Jong-un apparently is a big horror movie fan, and he has a collection of tens of thousands of horror movie DVDs from all over the world. And the regime in Cuba as well lives very comfortably. But what was my point? If you look at that index, if you study those 165 countries, and if you had to divide them into 4 categories, 4 quadrants. So the bottom quartile, if you had to compare the bottom quartile to the top quartile, so the least free countries to the most free countries, and then if you had to take each of those quartiles and look at the bottom 10%, the poorest people in those groups, the bottom 10% in the poorest countries earn on average about $1,700 per annum, compared to the poorest 10% in the top quartile. They earn about $14,000, which is about 8 times more.
Huge difference,
So it's much better to be a poor person in an economically free country than it is to be a poor person in an unfree country. And often, like your income is important, but also your protection from state interference, from intimidation by the government or infringement on your rights. That's also very important. So you have to factor that in when you evaluate the quality of life. So some countries you might have quite high economic growth, but these are kind of dictatorships where, if you think of the People's Republic of China, that they have experienced quite significant levels of growth, but the government is all powerful and your civil liberties are severely curtailed, and so that impacts on your quality of life as well. Your freedom as an individual is highly restricted.
So this is my golden question then. If you look all around the world, whether it's that index or just look at the world, watch some news, read some articles. If you look anywhere in the world, it seems to me that the more you lean towards communism, socialism, the more crappy it gets by the second financially for most people. And then on top of that, if you look at the specific countries that's communism or communistic now and where we are heading, it's exactly that thing of, although they say it's for the people, it never is. Never. I don't think there's an exception to this rule. So how come people are going for that? How come more? It seems to me, once again, I'm not an analyst of any type, but it seems to me like the world is more open to this whole idea of socialism. Why is it moving towards that direction if people can see with their own eyes? It is not what they tell you it is. There's always a big discrepancy between the income of the elite because I don't know what it is. Money corrupts or power corrupts or both, but it is always like that. But still people are open for it. Why?
Yeah. So look, I think the world is a complicated place, and sometimes it's difficult to understand what are the causal relationships between your decisions and the outcomes that result. So I think a lot of people around the world are still attracted to socialism because they're looking for an easy answer. So they see the problems manifesting, and they think, well, if we can just have the right people, the enlightened few, who can have more power to make decisions, then they can fix these problems, and then we'll arrive at more of an egalitarian, utopian kind of outcome. But I think there's some ideological roots to that go back actually to the Enlightenment, the 18th century and 19th century Enlightenment, and Karl Marx, who was the central figure in socialist thinking, writing in the 19th century. He believed that history was and social change was a product of these inevitable material circumstances, that basically the history of the world was one of class struggle, and that these are antagonistic forces. You have the working class, which is, he believed, fundamentally exploited by the owners of capital or the means of production, and that there needed to be a conflict between these two classes that would result in moving to the next stage of history where the workers now owned the means of production. And then that, he believed, would create a material equality between people. But I think what Marx fundamentally misunderstood was human nature, and that people often, first of all, it's very difficult to control all outcomes in a complex society. Earlier we were talking about how markets produce greater efficiencies and are based on the many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of interactions that take place on a daily basis between people. And I think also the socialist conception of human nature is that you can basically redesign human nature according to the vision of the anointed, of the greater enlightened people. And I think, that also, I think, opens up the possibility for power abuse. Because when you say, okay, well, we're going to concentrate power in the hands of a few people to make decisions on behalf of society, it's very tempting for those people to exercise their power in a way that infringes on the rights of individuals. And to go back to the Soviet Union again, the inheritor of Marx's ideology was Vladimir Lenin, who basically became frustrated with Marxist theory, and he believed that you shouldn't be waiting for a history to unfold, and that you actually need a dictatorship of the proletariat, that you need a vanguard, a group of people basically spearheading the revolution and catalyzing it, and then leading society after that. Marx's view was actually more that the state would actually end up withering away and would become irrelevant. But Lenin's conception was actually, no, you need the vanguard of the proletariat to direct economic relations and activity. And after the revolution in 1917, the economy actually started experiencing significant problems, and Lenin actually liberalized certain aspects of the economy through the new economic plan. And after a short period, he ended up passing away, I think in 1921, I think it was. And very shortly after that, there was a power struggle between Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And Stalin won, and very soon after that, he cemented his grip on power, eliminated his opponents, even in those days was able to Photoshop out some of his former comrades who he had fallen out with. And, he became all powerful, and nobody could challenge his authority. And he would determine how the economy would produce things. And all private property was eliminated. So there was a class of peasants who were sort of land-owning peasants. But they were very kind of poor people. They're called the kulaks. And Stalin rightly saw the kulaks as a threat to his power. And there was a vicious campaign of intimidation, extermination, murder initiated against the kulaks, who lost everything, their meager possessions. And because Stalin basically saw them as a threat to his state authority. So the socialist conception is a collectivist one. And I think the fundamental error that it makes is the conceit that man can determine what is best for another man, and that you can perfectly control all outcomes. And I think, by contrast, the liberal or the classical liberal conception and also the classical conservative conception entails a lot more humility. It says that, okay, people are prone to making mistakes. They don't necessarily know what's best for everyone. They have limited information. They know what's best for themselves, and can use their reason to determine what's best for themselves. But often, if you empower people extensively, then you can also open up the door for power abuse. And so there's a kind of a caution when it comes to human nature to say, well, actually, and to quote another Russian, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a dissident writer during the Soviet Union period, writing in kind of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he was imprisoned under the gulags, which were these labor camps in Siberia. And he wrote a book called the Gulag Archipelago, which was a recounting of all of the ways in which the Soviet state terrorized its citizens and eliminated dissenters. Yeah, and he wrote that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And I think there's profound wisdom in that actually, sometimes when we think about politics, we think about the good guys and the bad guys, fighting off against each other, and you just have to defeat the bad guys, your opponents, and then you'll arrive at a kind of a nirvana, an end state of history. But actually, often even the best intentioned people can be susceptible to a corruption of their soul.
Yeah.
And, and I think that links in with a long tradition in Western antiquity, which goes all the way back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, which, kind of identifies, and also the Christian tradition as well, which identifies the limits of human knowledge and human action. So there's a kind of a fatal conceit, as Hayek wrote, that you think that you can determine what's best for other people, but often the results of that are far more damaging and calamitous.
Soos met 'n goeie film, is musiek die mees belangrike faktor wat die atmosfeer van jou troudag sal bepaal. Dit maak of breek. Van die oomblik wat jou gaste opdaag tot dit die dansvloer sluit, sal Music for Weddings sorg dat jou persoonlike liefdesverhaal die perfekte lewende of opgeneemde klankbaan het. Vind meer uit by musicforweddings.co.za. Hulle het pakkette beskikbaar vir elke smaak en begroting. Bespreek SA se heel beste troumusiekverskaffer.
Well, I think that's why we love the idea of personal freedom, because if you make a mistake, a bad decision, you can correct on it and learn from it if it's your own thing and it's your own life. But if the government makes a mistake on your behalf with your stuff, it gets a bit tricky. And it seems to me, when you were talking about the stuff, that it, in a way, the answer to all the stuff is personal responsibility. In a way. So, David, we could go on and talk for hours about a lot of different things here. I think I want to end this for today with this question. What do you tell a a private person, a person listening to this podcast, what do they do in practice to get this thing to turn? What do we do? Because I think most people are like almost paralyzed by the thing of, well, it's there, it's the government, it's such a big majority of people that still vote for them, and and even if they don't, the one thing that baffles my mind is how you can take a government to court for breaking its own laws or against the constitution or whatever, and they just it's like important. There's nothing. They just keep on rolling. I think people there's a good Afrikaans word for facefoos. They are tired of trying to fight a system. What do they do except not give up?
Yeah, so if you consider what we've been talking about today, I think it's very important that first and foremost, you maintain a mindset which is skeptical of government action. And that's a very good departure point. So don't cede responsibility or give up responsibility voluntarily to the government. So a society such as ours involves different competing poles of power, right? So what do I mean by that? So if you consider the various civil society organizations, the Free Market Foundation is one. There are other entities like AfriForum or the Institute of Race Relations. These all act as a check and a balance against government power. Solidarity, the Solidarity movement, I think is a very good example of that, where people can come together on a voluntary basis and share resources, expertise, know-how, and also a willingness to solve problems. That is very, very important. So, and it's, I'm not just talking my own book here because I work for a think tank, but it's also, it's a domain of power and authority outside of the government. So religious organizations are another example. These are not just places of worship. They're places where communities are built and where relationships are cemented. And if you consider how many church groups and other religious organizations, mosques and so on, how they perform a social function, acting as charities or providing relief to poor people and so on. In many respects, like our welfare system in South Africa, which distributes about 28 million welfare grants every month, that is a way in which the state has engendered dependency by citizens on the government.
That's a huge topic.
Yeah. And when we say, the government must do this, must spend this money, well, what people are actually saying is that the government must take money from productive people and give it to unproductive people. And I think there are serious ethical problems with that. So cultivate a sense of independence is what I would say. And the commercial sector is also a very important alternative sphere of power. Corporates and companies have power outside of the state. Often they're in the South African context, it's complicated because often the corporates and the government are kind of working together, which we've been quite critical of because that promotes a kind of corporatism. And it's often the government that's taking the lead there. And sometimes when the private sector provides support, it's actually making up for the failures of the government. So we'd much rather see much more assertive posture by corporates towards the government. So that, I think, is very important to identify what are those areas in your life where you can build power outside of the state. So I think the school environment is also a really good example of this, like where you have the government interfering in schooling or controlling schooling, they can then set the terms of that. And so you have political actors like Panyaza Lesufi, who's very hostile towards Afrikaans communities. And he's using something like the Bella Act to basically change the language policies of schools and trampling over the authority of school governing bodies. So that is very unfortunate, but it is also a natural consequence of the government having authority over the school. So I would say, sending your children to a school that is not linked to the government is a good way of preserving the kind of education that you value and you want them to have. So thinking of ways in which you can state-proof yourself as well, I think, is very important. So getting yourself independent in terms of your energy production and water production, thinking about how you preserve your assets. If you invested in a provident fund in South Africa, the government, through regulation, is telling you which asset classes you can invest in, and that diminishes your ability to generate returns there. So not lending money to the government, I think, is a good idea. So not purchasing South African government bonds and enabling the government to basically write blank checks for itself and to get itself more involved in your life. The other way you can state-proof yourself is by reducing your tax burden and your tax exposure. So finding ways, working with an accountant, to minimize your tax burden. I think that is actually an ethical thing to do, and many people see paying tax as the right thing to do, but I see it as the result of coercion by the government, because if you don't pay your taxes, then the government's going to come after you. So find legal ways of reducing your tax exposure. And that could be around setting up your own company and claiming back expenses and so on, offshoring some of your wealth, getting involved in asset classes like Bitcoin. I'm very bullish on Bitcoin because that is permissionless. The state can't control your access to your resources. If you think of the banking system in this country and many other countries, through know your customer checks and other anti-money laundering legislation, that sounds very nice. Like you're protecting you from the bad guys and the criminals, but often it's a permission-based system. So if you fall foul, we even saw this in places like Canada during COVID. There was these protests around the vaccine mandates that were imposed by the Trudeau government. And so the truckers who were trading goods over the border with the United States, when they wanted to come back to Canada, they had to show their vaccine certificate, and some of them were against that. They were conscientious objectors. They didn't want to get the vaccine. And the government said, no, you can't do that. We're going to prevent you from working. And so they protested, and they organized a long trucker convoy through the snow, driving thousands of miles to Ottawa to express their dissent. And they were raising money for their campaign through crowdfunding initiatives, like these kind of Patreon kind of accounts. And the government didn't like that. They didn't like that they were doing that. They deemed that to be terrorist activity, and they froze all of those bank accounts. And so what did the protesters do? They pivoted to Bitcoin. And so there is a danger that the more power the government has, the more ability it has to strangulate you and cut you off from your own resources, right? So not only is it taxing you through coercion, but it can also say, well, we don't like what you're saying, or we don't like who you're associating with, or your belief system. So we're going to prevent you from accessing your own hard-earned money. So it's very important to build contingencies and backup systems that if the state were to do that to you, that you are not completely paralyzed. So it's not just about putting a solar panel on your roof or digging a borehole in your backyard. Those are probably good things to do. But also I think embracing privatization is also very important. Saying, okay, well, actually, energy or water, that is a commodity just like any other. And it is a network industry, but why does the government have a monopoly on those things? We should start to do those things ourselves. And you saw how during the load shedding peaks, how people started to basically produce their own energy just because that was a necessity. It was an economic necessity for them to do that. And the government didn't like that, but eventually the pressure became so much that they had to concede to allowing private energy production. And once they've conceded, then it's very difficult to roll that back. So we would actually argue for much more assertiveness by individual South Africans. Don't underestimate your power. Remember the e-tolls, how people just basically refuse.
I just wanted to mention that. There's a good example. People are not powerless.
And governments, they have a lot of power, but they also are very sensitive to public perception. They, don't want to lose face. They want to be seen as in charge, and so, they very quietly dropped the e-tolls. We'd like to see them quietly dropping a whole lot of other taxes.
That would be good.
In some ways, a user pay principle for public infrastructure is actually something we would support. But I think what was so objectionable about the e-tolls is that this was on top of many, many other
Taxes.
Taxes, like including all of the administered pricing that happens on your fuel when you pay at the pump. Nearly half of what you pay is going towards the road accident fund, which is like hundreds of billions of rands in debt. So I think having a bit of healthy skepticism, and that doesn't mean you must be cynical, but you must just understand what are the motivations of politicians, and they're often servicing their own constituents. Like, I'm based in Johannesburg, and I go running almost every morning, and I see pavements collapsing, potholes leaking, pipes, effluent flowing down the street, very stinky. Corné, can you tell me who is the mayor of Johannesburg? I know you live outside of
No.
Joburg. Okay. Well, don't feel bad, because most people, even in Joburg, don't know who the mayor of Johannesburg is. His name is Dada Morero, and he's a very special kind of politician, because he's an honest politician. Because when he came into power, he said, "Don't expect anything to change. Joburg is in such a terrible state." And I appreciate his honesty. But I'd also like to stop paying my rates to the city of Joburg, because clearly I'm not getting anything out of that, as are many of my fellow citizens here in the city of gold. So, how do you respond to that, where the government in Johannesburg is in financial disarray? There are these coalition governments with rather dubious politicians who just want to feather their own nests. Well, now you've got a choice. You can either watch your city and your community collapse around you, or you can start to acquire powers back from the city, and sometimes doing that involuntarily, not asking for permission, but rather asking for forgiveness. So there's a big debate at the moment around some of the public parks in Johannesburg, and the city of Joburg wants to sell some of them and build high-rise buildings. And Joburg's parks are one of the most beautiful features of the city, and really make it an enjoyable place to live. So people are understandably upset by the prospect of this. But we at the FMF have actually, we would say, yes, privatize the parks. Let community associations take over the running of those parks, because then they will actually be clean. And there's a park nearby to where I live in northern Johannesburg that has been basically taken over by a community group, and they've put some fencing around it and paid for security, and they do all the maintenance, and you can even donate to the association. And it's a very safe, pleasant park to go and play with your children or walk your dogs. And so actually having that community invested in that park, rather than delegating that responsibility to some bureaucrat who sits in Braamfontein, many kilometers away, who never bothers to come and visit the park anyway, and just wants to siphon off resources to line his own pockets. That's going to mean that park's going to be neglected. So if you value the park, you've got to take responsibility over it. It's the same with security. The private sector in South Africa, the security sector has done an amazing job in filling the void left by the collapsing police system.
Yeah.
And, we were talking earlier about what are the basic competencies of the state, and one of them is policing. But, I mean, this expose by Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, the general in KZN, reveals the extent of corruption within the police itself. And police are often committing crimes against citizens, and, you read all about those stories. So if you care about the safety of your community, you got to invest in community safety initiatives and private security. And even some of these private security groups, they have dog kennels and they pick up stray animals in the street, and they have initiatives where they maintain the verges and the pavements and so on. So, these are all things that need to be done. Dogs need to be collected when they run stray, and verges need to be maintained. Does it have to be the government that does that? I don't think so. I think you can have community level initiatives that can provide the scale for solving those kind of problems. Because one person alone can maybe not achieve very much. Like, I don't know about you, Corné, but I can't fill a pothole. I don't really know. I could try, but I probably would do a pretty bad job. I'm kind of an intellectual and a writer with soft hands. I don't think I would do a particularly good job. But it's also at the same time not necessarily an impossible thing to work out how to do. Right? It's not like the government has like some unique knowledge that nobody could replicate. And, there are private sector entities like insurance companies that are putting money towards filling potholes, and they do a very good job. It's the same with fire services. Back in the day, we all used to see the municipality fire trucks driving around the area, and you don't really see that anymore if you think about it. But it's important to be able to mitigate against the risk of fire and to fight fires when they break out. So, there are private entities that can provide that for a small fee, and downloading an app on your phone, you can hail a fire service instantaneously, and it'll get there a lot quicker than the government fire service. So I think understandably people are very concerned by the political situation in South Africa. They're worried about the future. But I would say you need to channel that energy into building alternatives and cultivating independence from the government. And I think that's a long play. It's going to take a lot of hard work. But if we value the life that we live here in South Africa, then I think we've got to work for that future that we want. And I think all communities, regardless of their race or their ethnic identity or the language that they speak, should be cultivating this kind of mindset. And I think we are a diverse country, and we've had conflict in the past, but I think we've also had cooperation, and we can foster a lot of that cooperation to build a better country for ourselves and for our children.
No, there's quite a few handful of things to look at, dear friends. If you, what do I do? There's a few options for you. David, I'm just back from last week. Last weekend was Kragdag, and I always love the experience there. It's always very positive. I always ask people, if money is not an option, would you rather go overseas or would you rather stay? And in 5 years, I had one exception of somebody said, no, they want to leave. If they have money, they'll go. People want to stay here. They feel this is their place. And at Kragdag, it's a lot of people who are making the plans. They're on there, how do we sort this out? How do we get proper food? How do we do this proper? How do we get energy? How do we do schooling? People who do things. I think in my mind, just it was a recent thought that people have this thing of it's the government and then kind of we down here. But legally, I think even we are above the government. They're supposed to be civil servants looking after our interests. And I think if people just realize that, you don't have to tap dance because they say. We need a bit more stiff-neckedness, I think, whatever you want to call it. You don't need to go start a rebel organization, but you maybe sometimes need to just say no. And the tollgate is such a good example because, most people are aware of that. It's a recent event. And most people was part of the rebellion. I thought, no, we're not going to do this. And it worked out. So I think if people have that same mindset around a lot of things, we don't need to necessarily. We can do this thing differently. And then for the rest, a personal opinion, well, you say it's a long haul. So yeah, let's stick with that. It's a long haul. It might take a while. Listen, David, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I'm going to release you to go back to your writing. Good luck with all your work. I wish you all the success. And I hope we can, at some stage, talk about some more stuff because there's bunches of things to talk about. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome, Corné, anytime. And good luck with your content. I think you've got a great platform here. And I think you're open to having really meaningful conversations about what it means to live here in South Africa and how to create a better, more free life for ourselves. So, yeah, thank you for having me on.
Dannhauser se reeks natuurlike vloeibare seep sal jou vel, jou hare, jou hande en sommer al jou sintuie aangenaam verras, sommer jou beursie ook. Die lyfreeks word uit luukse, bevochtigende olyf en klapperolie verseep met slegs natuurlike ekstra bestanddele. Die wasgoedseep is hard op vlekke, sag op die natuur. Bederf jouself. Besigtig die volledige reeks en bestel by huwelied.co.za. Goed vir jou vel, goed vir die natuur. Radio Nuwe.
Your Christian lifestyle radio station.